years in millions of homes. A man loved a woman, a child it was born. It learned how to hurt and it learned how to cry like humans do. I'm breathing in, I'm breathing.
Hello and welcome to the 197th Tommy Rocket Show. We're here with world-class journalist Peter Phipps, formerly of the Providence Journal-Bulletin, and Joann Flaminio, formerly of the Boston Marathon Association. Welcome. Peter, thank you for bringing her. Tell us what you've got in store for us today.
Well, we're going to talk about the Boston Marathon. We're going to talk about women's athletics. We're going to talk about the fact that a growing number of women are running and happiness and health. And you were chairman from 2011 to 2017, president.
Correct.
Which covers a period of tragedy. So let's, because it's the Boston Marathon and we think about these things, let's talk about that day, April 15th, 2013, that fateful day. But I think we all sort of know what happened, but what was it like when it was an innocent day? What was the morning like?
So, I mean, that morning started out like every other morning. It was a great day for a run. I remember walking out to the stands. My job as the president is to oversee the activity that happens at the finish line on Boylston Street. And I had just come in from the starting line, and it was a beautiful day to be in Boston. I call it the unofficial beginning of spring, Patriots Day and the marathon. Sure. In the city of Boston, and it was a beautiful day. It was about 50, good weather for a marathoner, bright blue skies, and the sun was out.
So, just to go back a second, we know what happens next, sort of, but during the year in the meetings, did you talk about security a lot? And how did those, I guess it's hard not to see it, those conversations as ironic, but what were they like?
Sure. I mean, just like Rhode Island, we have an agency in Massachusetts called MEMA, or the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. And during the lead up to the Boston Marathon, all of the first responders, public safety officials, city and town officials, state officials, the FBI, they all get together in a bunker in Framingham for a day and talk about what if scenarios. What if this happened? What if this happened? And so they call them tabletop exercises. So certainly, given the fact that this is post-2001, they certainly run through a variety of scenarios.
Right. So then you were at the finish line. You were holding the yellow ribbon, as you usually do.
Really?
For both men and women? Did you do both?
No. I typically am assigned either one or the other.
Right.
Yeah.
And which did you do that year?
What did I do that year? I think I probably did the women.
Right. So then you're in it now. What time is it? It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that?
Yeah. So again, after all the dignitaries are there, the governor and the mayor, and we've awarded the olive wreath to the male and the female winner. My part of the stands tends to get empty because all the corporate types go back to wherever they were. And so I'm watching, and later in the afternoon, the stands fill up again because that's when the first-timers come through. Those folks who might be running for a charity or somebody who was a serious amateur who made his qualifying time and is here, for the very first time in his life. So the stands filled up with all of the spectators and mothers and fathers and well wishes. And so somebody bumped me in the arm, and I thought to myself, you know what? Everything is going so well here. Why don't I take a walk?
This is about 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
This is about 2:40, yes.
2:40?
2:40.
Right.
About 5 minutes before. And so I left the grandstands and I walked through the medical tent. And we have a first-class, world-class medical tent. After all, it is the city of Boston with world-class medical facilities, et cetera. And there were 500 volunteer medical personnel of all shapes and sizes talking about, tending to blisters and a little bit of dehydration and cuts and anything that you might happen after 26 miles of running. But mostly they were standing around saying, okay, when our shift is over, where are we going to have dinner that night?
Right.
And so then I went from there across the street into the Fairmont Copley, which Marathon Weekend is transformed into our headquarters. I walked into the press room and heard the first bomb. And then soon after, looked at my communications manager, Jack Fleming, and then heard the second bomb.
Did you know
And what were you?
it was?
Excuse me, saying what? And what were the were you seeing something on the cameras?
No.
Were they
So,
showing, no,
well,
excuse me.
we're basically seeing it's what's in that room is sort of a board that says, just like that shows the progress of all of the runners.
I see.
But I looked and I knew even at that very second that something had happened that was dramatically wrong.
Right, Tommy.
I was just going to say, when you heard that noise, did you know it was a bomb?
Well, I knew that it wasn't correct. And I really looked at someone and I knew in the pit of my stomach that something had really happened that was horrendously wrong and evil, et cetera. So I knew that we were in store for a rough afternoon.
And then what happened in the first minutes then?
So things happened very quickly, as you can imagine. The hotel closed its doors. Everything shut down. The cable service was shut off. Cell phone service, telephone service, because I think the city was afraid that there were more bombs. They didn't know what the heck was going on. And so they took all these immediate steps to stop everything. And so I could not leave the hotel. And for about an hour or two, I was sheltered in a hotel room along with the CEO of John Hancock Manulife, our sponsors, and the executive director of the marathon. So. And at that point, believe it or not, we were watching TV just like everybody else.
And the fact is, what, 260 some people were injured?
Right. So, we were very lucky that day, Peter, because if this had happened in Hopkinton, for example, if they had picked the beginning of the marathon, there's no medical facilities there. We were so lucky that 600 yards down the road from the finish line where the bombs went off, there were those 500 to 600 medical personnel ready to go into business, ready to do their job, ready to show off their expertise in ways that they didn't think they were going to have to do that day. But it was a miraculous scene, and a scene, believe it or not, that was over in 22 minutes. So anybody who was injured within that time frame was transported to an area hospital, and anybody who was transported survived. And it was extraordinary that they were there and so close. In 22 minutes, you could have gone out back to Boylston Street and not known that anything had happened. The street was clear. Again, because I was locked in the Fairmont, it's not a sight that I've ever seen.
But part of it, fortunately, and it was tragic, but fortunately, it happened at the right time for the medical establishment, right?
Extraordinary. It happened at 2:49. So as you all know, medical personnel typically work a 7 to 3, 3 to 11. So we were lucky in that, very, very, very lucky in that the first shift was asked to stay, the second shift was coming in. So when all of those injured folks were transported to all of the local hospitals, there were emergency teams and surgical teams in place to do all the necessary surgeries.
And the issue is you could, without speed, people were going to bleed out and die.
That's correct.
Right?
That's correct. So between the fact that there were ambulances there to take care of injured runners,
right,
but now they were taking care of injured spectators for the most part, and there were so much medical personnel there, and they had already had these routes and these operating on this schedule for the marathon. It was extraordinary. And so we were very, very, very lucky.
Who took over then? You weren't in charge anymore.
Oh, God, no.
So
oh, God, no.
Who took over? Who was in charge? Who was running things at this point?
So, I think, I think of a site that I saw a few hours later, Peter. And in the next door hotel, there was an assemblage of personnel and people that I will never again see in my life. They had a floor of a hotel empty, and it had every public safety, public service organization you could possibly imagine. Wow. Every congressperson, every mayor, every U.S. senator, unbelievable assemblage of people in that room, which is that later on that evening when the first of a continuous series of press conferences started. So I believe what happened is the information starts to filter through and come into all of these folks, and then gets disseminated out to the public as decisions are made.
And then when could you go home? When could you come back to Rhode Island? You live in Providence?
I do live in Providence. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone, as I was president of the BIA. But yes, I do live in Providence and have lived here for many, many years. So, the next few days were extraordinary. I spent the night that evening in the hotel. The next day, I went to a press conference that established the One Fund that raised an extraordinary amount of private money for all of the victims and the survivors. I went to funeral services. I went to the service with President Obama that Thursday. And then I came home, and it was very, very strange, because when I came back to Providence, I felt I was in a completely different place. And then, like everybody else, as the continuous the circumstances surrounding the manhunt for the Tsarnaev brothers, I was basically glued to my TV like everybody else.
So you didn't have any line of information into the FBI or anything like that?
No. Yeah. I was particularly unimportant at that point.
And then when did you start thinking about 2014?
You know, at first, I'm not a person who sheds that many tears, but I remember distinctly sharing some tears the next morning, thinking to myself, who will ever want to run our race again? You know, and really being upset. And I remember that next morning, the governor came in, Governor Patrick at the time, who I thought was extraordinary during the crisis, saying that, you know, we're going to start right now preparing for 2014. And we did. It was a slow process of recovery. It was a slow process of dealing with all of the runners who at mile 22 were said, after training for all those months, said, you know, you can't go any further, stop here, you know. And so, you know, it started the very next morning in the office of the BAA.
But no one even suggested we're going to cancel or there won't be a marathon, although the fear was running through your mind.
Yeah, I mean, at the very next morning, the fear was definitely running through my mind, thinking, you know, what just happened? How are we going to carry on? But no, I mean, you know, I think a couple of days later, after what had happened, there was an article by Friedman in the New York Times, and he says something like, you know, let's repair the pavement immediately, fix the windows, fill the potholes, and leave no trace, and return life to normal. And, you know, we run open on our streets, men and women, young and old, new immigrants and foreigners in shorts, not armor. I mean, the thing that is so miraculous about a marathon, the Boston Marathon in particular, if you think about it, all you got to do is qualify. So there are people there. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're
all over the world.
All over the world. If you're from Tanzania or Framingham, you know, you run alongside each other.
Right.
Not to interrupt, but we're coming very close to the end of the first segment of the Tommy Rocket Show, so stay tuned for these public service announcements, and we'll be back.
You hear people say it all the time. Someone else will do it. Someone else will donate blood. Because someone needs blood every 2 seconds. I'm happy to do it. It's just that it's a lot for one person to take on. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
People go, fish don't have feelings. I'll go, have you ever seen a fish gasping for breath when you take it out of the water? They're saying, thanks a lot for killing me. It feels great, you know? No, it hurts.
Hi, and welcome back to the second segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. As you know, we're here with Joann Flaminio and Peter Phipps. The topic is the Boston Marathon. Peter?
So 2014 came.
Yep.
And how was it different?
Well, you know, I almost think for me personally, Peter, the time leading up to the 2014 race was even more traumatic and more stressful for me personally, for a few reasons. The first is that, you know, traditionally we're the world's oldest continuously run marathon. So on marathon day, we get a lot of attention in the world. So we deal with the world press and world sporting press. But this was different. No longer we were a sporting event, we were a news event. You know, the running community was solidly behind us, the American people were solidly behind us. Everybody wanted us to get this right. They wanted to believe, as I did in my heart, that we were capable of running a safe and successful marathon. Really, my definition of the Boston Marathon really changed that year. Mostly I wanted it to be a safe event. The other thing that you should understand is that we would talk about safety, we would talk about security. We're not in the Boston Garden, we're not in the Providence Civic Center. I mean, how do you make that safe? We run open through seven cities and towns.
Right.
We can't put it in a bubble.
No.
So what happened the next year, again, you want to talk about the involvement of public safety officials and first responders.
Right.
There was an extraordinary response, an extraordinary movement to make this as safe as possible. We instituted all kinds of rules regarding what could come to the marathon. We instituted, new.
In other words, backpacks.
Everything had to be.
Yeah.
Everything had to be clear and transparent. New rules for runners, what they could take with them to Hopkinton. New rules for spectators. We spent close to, believe it or not, $500,000 putting together a security command center in the Boston Public Library that deals with what happens on that day in terms of the event. So it's funny, our race director is somebody about world famous Dave McGilvery, who runs Dave McGilvery Sports Enterprises, and he will tell you that his world changed entirely. That mostly when he puts together these events now, it's not only about the running, it's also about security.
Yeah. And then there was a remarkable bit of running history made.
There was a lot
After many years of foreign winners, what happened in 2014?
So incredibly, Meb Keflezighi won the marathon on that day. Keflezighi is from Eritrea, so he is an East African, but he was raised in the United States. He graduated from UCLA. He was a national champion. And what happened that day is extraordinary. As is typical, there were a group of these little sports here, because it is, after all, sports.
It's an event.
There is a group of East African runners in a pack, and Meb was all by himself and had just taken off. And the East Africans, the best in the world, gave him short shrift that he was coming back after not having run very well. He was wearing Skechers sneakers. I mean, nobody took him seriously. And what happened in 19, 20, 21, 22, those miles of the marathon was truly incredible, because by the time they figured out that he was still in front.
Now, let me, just for people who don't know, they've gotten to the top of the infamous Hills of Newton.
Correct.
And they're coming into Boston College, if anybody knows Boston, and they've come into the Green Line, and the trains are there.
And there's too much of a gap. There's too much of a gap between Meb and the pack behind him. And I think I have never seen a happier but more incredulous man in my life. When he was crossing the finish line, he kept looking behind him saying, I can't believe this. I am going to win this thing. And I will never, for the rest of my life, hear a more glorious roar when Meb Keflezighi crossed the finish line. It was like a movie that day. It was incredible.
What was his time? Do you remember?
It was 2:08:37.
A good time.
Not very good, and his best marathon ever, the best marathon he has ever run.
So what happened, evidently, he powered up the hills, and they expected he'd come back.
They expected he would fall off, and that they would have plenty of time to catch up to him.
Yeah.
And they miscalculated in a way. Yeah. They were more concerned about each other, and because they were supposedly better marathon runners with more impressive times.
Right.
And so they let him go. They didn't worry about him, and they should have. Because when they finally woke up, it was too late. It was unbelievable. I don't know if you remember, there's this glorious photo of Meb running after he won, holding the American flag and running up and down. Every elite marathoner wants to win the Boston Marathon. It changes his or her life from that day forward.
Right.
It is the crown jewel. It is the Super Bowl of distance running.
Right. Now, people of color have won this race in recent years, Africans, many, but it was started by a bunch of white guys, Brahmins, upper class. Boston guys, right?
Brahmins.
What were they doing?
Yeah.
Why did they bother?
Why did they start the Boston
Yeah.
Marathon? Well, I can tell you a little bit about that. In 1897 was the first Boston Marathon, but it really starts 1 year earlier. In 1896 was the start of the modern Olympics. And so the team of U.S. athletes traveled to Greece, to Athens, for the Olympics. And they saw a long-distance running event, which was preceded we presently know as a marathon. And so They came back, and the incredible thing is most of the members of the U.S. Olympic team in 1896 were members of what was known then as the Boston Athletic Association. So, they were a big deal. They were very, very good athletes. They had come out of a lot of the esteemed institutions around the bend across the river at Harvard and elsewhere. And so they came back and decided, we have these BAA games. Why don't we attach a marathon to it? So in April of 1897, a group of 15 guys went out to then Ashland, drew a stake in the road and said, okay, let's run into the city. They chose Ashland because there was a train that you could take back and forth at that point, and so they ran in. And somebody by the name of John McDermott won the first Boston Marathon, and it was off.
Right. Now, in the first early years, there were Native Americans and Native North Americans who competed and won and were multiple winners.
Right.
That seems curious to me. What was the story behind Tom? What's his name?
Tom Longbow?
Tom Longbow.
Yeah, but what drew them to the marathon?
And Brown from Rhode Island?
Right. It's really interesting. I think for the most part, for runners, for people who knew they were pretty good at the sport, it was really known as the best marathon.
The prestige.
The prestige.
Right.
And to try to finish and to try to win at Boston was seen as not only the greatest challenge, but the greatest reward.
But were there other marathons in the when did the rest of the world sort of catch up?
The rest of the world didn't catch up for a very, very long time.
Right.
The oldest marathon is a marathon by the name of, it's a Košice, it's in Slovenia, it's about 90 years old. But if you think of like the big ones, like Boston and Chicago and London and Berlin and Tokyo, their ages are their mid-40s, mid-50s, so they really came into being after the running boom of the 70s. And so what we really stand on, in addition to everything else, is all of our history and all of our tradition, and nobody can really match the Boston Marathon in that respect.
Now one of the things we were going to talk about, and we naturally are getting there, but no women.
Right.
Like women weren't allowed, couldn't, didn't. Now what?
Was there a rule that said women could not participate, or was it just that they didn't enter?
Well, I looked it up this morning in preparation for coming here, and there was women's track and field in the Women's Olympics starting in the 1920s. But there really wasn't any really wide-scale women's running up until the 60s and 70s, when it started to explode, along with sort of a generalized running expansion and explosion in the United States. And at that point, it was all governed by what was known as the Amateur Athletic Union, the AAU. And at that point, they didn't think women would be able to run more than 1.5 miles. So that was the limit on the distance that women could run.
So that's what, 3,000 meters or 20 something? So
Right.
That was it.
So men were running marathons.
This is the 60s.
This is the
Women
60s and
couldn't
70s.
go too much more than a mile.
That's correct. That's correct. It really is correct.
Yeah, right.
And so, I often, when I speak to women, and particularly young women, I will say to them, if you want to run a road race, what do you do? And they'll say, I go to my cell phone or my iPhone, or and I just click a few buttons and I'm in. And when I tell them that up until around the 70s and 80s, you weren't even allowed to enter, they look shocked.
Yeah.
But that really, really was the truth, and it was all about to change.
Right. And we're going to talk about Kate Switzer in 1967 coming up, but was there anything brewing? She was sort of a surprise on the scene. She burst on the scene, but was there any sense nationally that people were saying, "Look, this is ridiculous. The Olympics. Yes. I can't even run 5,000 meters if I'm not male in the Olympics." Through the 50s and the early post-war era. What's the context that brought Kate to the forefront?
I think it was brewing. I think there were pockets of women runners in New York and elsewhere that were beginning to run. Actually, in 1996, there was another runner called Bobby Gibb. Bobby Gibb, who jumped out of the bushes in Hopkinton and actually finished the race in 1966 as well.
Right.
So it was.
But she didn't get the press.
She didn't get the press.
And we'll get the reason why.
No.
Right.
We'll get back to all of that when we come back for the third segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. So stay tuned, and you'll be glad you did.
Hi, I'm Alicia Silverstone with PETA. When it comes to animals, there's no need to be a classroom cut-up. Use your right to refuse to dissect frogs, cats, pigs, even worms. Contact me at PETA for information on exciting, humane alternatives to dissection. They'll help you make the grade without using animals. Remember, biology is the study of life, not death. Thanks.
Hi, and welcome back to the third segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. Peter, what were we discussing about women in the marathon?
We were, and we were just joking in the break about how there were 3 famous women in the Boston Marathon.
That's funny.
That's unfair to say that because there were a string of winners and very high-class, high-end athletes. But the 3 were, we talked about Gibb, who jumped out of the bushes and ran as a bandit, right?
Jumped out of the bushes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, you can do that. You can kind of jump into the race without being an entrant. Right. And there's Kate Switzer, who's the most famous. And then there's, tell us the story again, Rosie Ruiz.
Yeah, for people that don't know
who Rosie Ruiz was.
Oh, Rosie Ruiz was a runner. And so back in the old days, before the onset of the chip in the foot, we used to have, and we still do to a certain extent, have spotters at every checkpoint. There's a team of people sort of marking down the names or whatever. And so when Rosie Ruiz crossed the finish line.
No, what year was this? 80-something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When she crossed the finish line, first of all, nobody knew who she was. In other words, and if everybody knows who's going to win. I mean, there's a 50-page media booklet on who were the best runners in the world that day and who should we look for. And so, and the true winner, Jackie Garreau, is somebody who would have been in that book, and Rosie Ruiz was not. And so when she was coming down Boylston Street, everyone said, gee, who is this woman? And so she crossed the finish line, was crowned the winner. But then when people went back to look at everything, they saw that they couldn't find her number or name in any of the checkpoints along the way. And it was determined later on that she really hadn't run the marathon and had merely run the first 6 or 7 miles, gotten on the subway, gotten off the subway, and then jumped in and finished.
And as Tommy said, and her name lives on as a joke line forever.
Yeah,
which is too bad,
infamous.
because I would hate for people to know her name rather than the glorious female runners who run the race every single year.
But now let's go to the year that stands out in most people's minds when it comes to women's athletics and women's marathon running, Kate Switzer. It's 1967. She's from Syracuse. Give us the background.
Sure. So Kate Switzer was a junior at Syracuse, and she was an athlete, and she was interested in running. There was no women's cross country team at the time in '67 at Syracuse, which was a very good athletic school, member of the NCAA.
Or anywhere almost.
Or anywhere. So she started running informally with the men's cross country team, and in particular, this is often the case in track, a mailman assistant coach of the Syracuse cross country team named Arnie Briggs. And so during the course of the cold, hard winter in '66, she trained. She started training and running longer and longer and longer with this guy named Arnie. So Arnie was going to run the Boston Marathon. She said, I'm going to run the Boston Marathon. He said, you can't run the Boston Marathon. Women can't run the Boston Marathon. So she filled out an application, and rather than putting her name, Catherine Switzer, she put KV Switzer.
And you don't think there was a male-female box at that time?
Oh,
Because
God, no.
it was
Because
irrelevant, right?
It was completely irrelevant. There had never been a woman, ever.
No reason to ask.
No reason to ask.
Right.
So she was admitted into the Boston Marathon. So she stood there in her sweats. It was
Her hair was tucked in a hat?
Her hair was tucked in, which is funny because Catherine's very feminine. And to this day, if you see her run, she will have a very feminine tutu outfit on. But that day, she was covered up with some sweats. And she started off the race along with Briggs and her boyfriend Tom, and around,
Tom's a big guy, right?
big guy, a Syracuse hammer thrower. And so around 6 or 7 miles in, Jock Semple, who was on the press bus.
Well, tell us about this. The press bus.
The press bus just went alongside in those days, and incredibly.
To take photos.
To take photos.
And he had walkie-talkie, and he got an alert, right?
Right, he got an alert that there was a woman on the course. So he found the women on the course, and the bus opened up, and Jock Semple, who was the
press bus filled with photographers
and reporters and everything else, he jumps off the bus. She had a number on that said 261. He goes to grab the number, and the big football player pushes Jock Semple out of the way and he says to her, "Get out of my race." And they push him out of the way. And meanwhile, the cameras are going, and the rest is sort of history. She goes on to finish.
Did she keep running?
Oh, definitely.
But she sort of, you said she was a PR major.
Yeah.
She sort of sensed that she was in the middle of a PR event, right? So she had the savvy to understand the moment.
To use the press.
Absolutely.
So
she finishes the race.
Not feeling great.
But knowing how important it is.
She has to finish.
She knows how important it is.
Right.
She said, "I'm going to finish this race. If I finish this race
She
on
knows
my
she
hands
has
and knees."
to.
She knows she has to.
Right.
So the greatest story of all is that then she tells the story is that they got back into the VW bus to go back to Syracuse, to go back to school. They stop in Albany. It's late at night, and they stop in a convenience store for Cokes and
all the early New York papers have arrived at the convenience store.
So the convenience store owner is looking at the papers and looking at her and looking at the papers, and he said, "I think you should take a look at this." And there she was on the front page of every single newspaper, the photo, now iconic, of her being pushed out of the race by Jock. And the photo is, the image is really what transformed her.
It's history.
It's history. It's been what transformed women's sports. It's what I believe really began to push the movement towards better equality, more money being spent on women's sports, and ultimately which led to the passage of Title IX in 1972. It really, the next year, informally, there were women in the race, and finally in 1972, in April of 1972, women were officially allowed to enter the Boston Marathon.
And they ran in the Olympics that year.
Well, no.
In LA, no?
So not. It's slow progress, Peter.
Right.
It really didn't happen overnight. So, after she finished at Syracuse and continued to run, she took part in started something called the Avon International Women's Running Circuit, and she started to establish road races all over the world. And finally, in 1984, got the U.S. Olympic Committee to agree. 84 was the first women's marathon in the Olympics. Of course, that was held in Los Angeles at the Coliseum, and you might remember Joan Benoit Samuelson, a New Englander from Maine, coming out of the tunnel, being the first woman to win the first Olympic marathon.
I remember it was very hot. There was a woman who had to crawl across the finish line or something.
Right, that wasn't her, but I think that was the woman after her.
But she was from England or something,
Yep.
and
Yeah. And
horrible. I frankly remember that more.
Right.
The guts of finishing like that.
But Joan Benoit Samuelson won the Boston Marathon twice. She is a pioneer for women's running, and she started something called the Beach to Beacon Road Race, which I believe is this weekend in the state of Maine, the largest road race in Maine.
Yeah. And now tell me the lead up to Title IX. People may not, as you said, you talk to young women. When I was going to high school and college too, there really weren't any interscholastic sports for women. It wasn't, you couldn't be on the women's basketball team. You could be a cheerleader when I was going to school. And that, how did Title IX and how did Kate Switzer, what role did she play, do you think, in Title IX and getting that passed?
You know, I think a lot of things were happening then, but I think things like her run and her photo pushed the Congress to finally adopt Title IX in '72. And you know, just like anything else, Peter, it's all about the money. What Title IX mandated was that you spend as much money on women's sports as
Radical but simple idea.
as much as on women's sports as you do on men, and the game was suddenly completely changed.
Right.
And so when I got to high school, I think it was still more limited, but the game was changing. You know, it was okay for a woman to be an athlete, and I think that happened. Believe it or not, between the 60s and the 70s. So the world was a very tough place in 68, 69, 70. There was a lot of change happening politically and otherwise. And so I think along with that came all of these changes in women's sports, women's athletics, and Title IX, which, it's all about the money.
Right. And so how did she become a cultural figure? So how over the years, what did she do, or how did she capitalize on her number, for example, became legendary?
So as she would travel around the world and continue all of her advocacy work, women would come up to her and say, they would know the photo. They knew the photo, they knew the story. And so they would continually come up to her and say, you're an inspiration to me. I think about you all the time and how fearless you were in being pushed out of that race, but yet having the courage to continue and the resilience to get there, and knowing that that was an important moment for women. And so the next woman would come up and say the same thing, and she would say, I wear your number, 261, in honor of you, because I realized that you were pivotal for what happened, which allows me to run now.
She inspired all those women. She inspired
a generation of women, truly.
That's big.
And,
it's huge.
And she works at it to this day, right?
She works at it to this day. So I don't know. Incredibly, and in the sort of the latter years of my presidency at the BAA, we decided to have a year called 50 Years of Women at Boston. And so it began with the 50th anniversary of Roberta Gibb
right.
in 1966.
And she came to that?
And she came to that and was celebrated widely. She was the Grand Marshal, I believe, that year, and very happy. And then culminated, though, at the end of the very next year in 1967 with Catherine, who had decided on the 50th anniversary of her run in 1967 to lace it up,
2017 and bring it back.
To lace it up again and to go out to Hopkinton.
And she ran.
And she ran again.
So we'll talk about that event, right?
Yeah,
After
and
the
when
break.
we come back, because we're coming very close to the end, so stay tuned for the last segment of the Tommy Rocket Show with Joann Flaminio and Peter Phipps, and we'll be back.
Hi, this is Bill Maher, Politically Incorrect. I can find humor in almost anything, but one thing I never laugh about is cruelty to animals. If you don't get the joke either, write People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, 501 Front Street, Norfolk, Virginia, 23510.
Hello, I'm James Cromwell. In recent years, the emergence of factory farms like this one has meant bad news for pigs. The largest U.S. slaughterhouses kill one pig every 3 seconds. Such an accelerated speed means that millions of animals have their throats slit or are dropped into scalding tanks while they are still conscious. Pigs are sensitive, intelligent animals. Please do your part. Stop eating pigs. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome back to the fourth and final segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. As you know, we're talking about the Boston Marathon with Peter Phipps and Joann Flaminio. Peter, where were we?
Well, we were talking about Kate Switzer coming back 50 years later.
And she ran.
And this was your last year as president, and there was a lot of
the first president of the
first, and you were brought in as a reformer.
Yes,
when
I
they
was.
had a sort of diversity issue of white guys running the Boston Marathon, right?
Right.
And so here was your. So everything was sort of coming together in a big emotional way, right?
Correct.
So tell us about that day, or that event, or what it was like. That.
Yeah. So it was again, it was pretty good weather that day, and Catherine. I think we're going to talk a little bit about this, was running alongside another group of women as part of an organization called 261 Fearless. So in our last segment, we talked a little bit about how all of these women were motivated and inspired to run. And so Catherine thought, well, what can I do? How can I take this movement forward. You know, I'm 70 years old when I'm running this marathon in 2017. Really? You know, I'm not going to be here forever. But how can I keep this notion alive, this idea of women's running, of empowerment through running? And so she decided to start a nonprofit called the 261 Fearless Foundation. And so, given what's happening in our culture today, it couldn't be more timely. So often the women who don't run say it's too competitive. I couldn't join a running club or anything like that. They run too fast for me. Mm-hmm. And so she got this idea to start local running clubs in a non-competitive way, and to empower women, to make them feel good about each other.
That's great.
Right. And so presently, you know, I'm a global volunteer for 261 Fearless. And so basically what it is local, non-competitive clubs of women that are springing up all over the world, not just all over the country, all over the world. There's some in New Zealand, there are some in Austria, there's a lot in Germany, there's starting to be some in Africa. And basically it's an opportunity for women to get together, all women, and to come together for an hour to enjoy each other's company, mm-hmm. to do something athletic, to support each other, to empower each other. And it's really a transformative global women's movement.
And at the same time, don't the numbers show that in road races across the world, there are either more than half or close to half of the participants are women? There are no longer as many women-only 5Ks and the pink races and all that business. It's mainstream half marathons, for example, isn't the number quite high?
It's half.
Yeah. Yes, incredibly. The people who, if you go to your local road race on a Saturday or Sunday morning, just about anywhere in the country, and you look at the field, you will see that it's mostly women, or at least half women. You know, in last year's Boston Marathon, you know, Catherine was a trailblazer, but there were 14,000 women who laced up their sneakers and ran in last year's Boston Marathon, and 95% finished, so all of them passed the finish line. And for whatever reason, for young women, for millennial women, the sport is really running. All they need is a pair of sneakers. I think they like to run for, it makes them feel good. It makes them, it's good recreation for them. It's wellness for them. And they have really taken over the roads, particularly at as you say, in the half marathon distance, where almost at least 50% of every single half marathon is women. So it's that incredible. Day, I don't know where the men are, Peter. I don't know where all you guys are. I guess you're doing Tough Mudders or whatever. But you're not in the road races anymore.
So
that's impressive.
Yeah, it's very impressive.
72. I mean, when she was she 72 at the 50th?
She was 70.
70. At the 50th year in 2017, what was the scene like? This all came together so media always looking for a way to tell a story. So the way to tell the story of women running in the world was her 50th year, and it all came together in Boston that day.
So I've never seen the crush of reporters or worldwide attention to any run as much as I did that day with Catherine. And the Boston Marathon and the Boston Athletic Association took the novel step of retiring her number as well. So we took 261 and retired the number, so no one else will ever run with the number 261.
That's nice.
And so if you look often at the photo, whatever, the famous reproduction of it is not simply the 261, but also 261 with a little rip and tear in the corner, because that's when Jock went to
pull her
and he ripped it off. So if you look at it, it's not only the number, but it's got a rip in the corner.
In the logo for 261 Fearless.
Correct. Correct.
That's good. And that was a meaningful way to end it for you, your presidency?
Yes, it was. I really wanted to stay through the culmination of 50 years of women, and I was the first woman president of the BAA, so I just thought it was fitting and wonderful for me to be around during that great celebration.
So as you look back...
Historic.
As you look back, you must have a scat of memories. What are some of them? And
you know, I really have two, Peter, and be more than happy to share both stories or both comments.
Please.
The first one involves Meb. And all of the runners in 2014. You know, when, you know, there's a Roger Robinson who who happens to be Catherine Switzer's husband, is a wonderful running historian, an Australian elite runner, and he came out recently with a book called When Running Made History. And he talks a lot about the very good book. It just came out. He talks a lot about the 2014 race.
Not 2013.
2014
I know.
race.
Not the year of the tragedy. The book's about the year of
You know,
the success.
and in addition to being a running fan, I'm also a pretty heavy baseball fan. And it reminds me of Jackie Robinson in 1947, when he and the Brooklyn Rodgers took the field on the first day of baseball season. So, you know, they were playing baseball like they always did. But when each and every batter came, it was about something more than that. It was elevated. It was when running made history. And that's the same thing that happened for every single of those runners who run in 2014. With each and every run, they were restoring the glory and the majesty of Marathon Day.
To show not to be afraid.
But they were also saying, you know, we're back in business, America. We're back in business running. We're not going to be afraid. We're going to go about our business. It was history. It was a strange intersection of sport and history that doesn't really happen all that often.
And you had to have a feeling going into that day of trepidation, no?
Oh, horrible trepidation, because scared. Yeah, I just, again, for me, I didn't care who won that day. The fact that Meb won that day was extraordinary. There couldn't be a better global ambassador for our sport and for the Boston Marathon than Meb Keflezighi. He's a wonderful, wonderful person, wonderful running presence. But all I cared about truly was for everybody to be safe.
Right.
You know, so it was a lot of pressure, and happily it was an extraordinary day.
Yeah, and peaceful and orderly, and yet there's another memory that has a more direct, I believe, connection to 2013. No.
Right. So this is my number one heartwarming story from all of my years as president. You know, I was honored and privileged to be president during those 7 years, and I was able to attend the 2012 London Olympics to see the men and the women's marathon there, and so I spent about a week there, and so in between both events, the women's marathon was one weekend, the men's marathon was another weekend. I was on the subway going to another event with the treasurer of the BAA at the time, and London was just an incredibly well-run, efficient sporting event. You know, I've got attuned to sort of looking at sporting events, and this one was top shelf. So we were on the subway, and there was a couple of family going to another event, and we chatted it up for a little while. He was an avid runner. He was taking his whole family to a different event, and we told him who we were, why we were there. We were going to watch the women's and the men's marathon. We exchanged cards.
Cards, yeah.
And
so you connected with these people
we connected.
on the train.
It was 15 minutes on a hot train in London in August of 2012. So we went on our way to where we were going. They left and went on their way. And so the morning after the bombing, I was in the offices of the Boston Athletic Association. We were all there. We were waiting for the governor to come, and everybody was there and kind of frightened and wondering what was coming next. And the treasurer at the time, she said to me, "Did you see this?" And I said, "No, I didn't see this." And it was an email. And it was an email from the guy on the subway.
Yeah.
And I will never, for the rest of my life, forget what he wrote. He said, "I don't know if you remember me." He said, "But we met last year for a few minutes on the London subway." He said, "You were there for the Olympics, and we were off to an event, me and my family." He said, I just want you to know that we're thinking of you here in London, and that you will get through this. We got through this." He said, "Us Londoners know a lot about bombs, and it, you know, it will be rough, but you will get through this. And the world is watching you. The world is with you." And I will always remember that. That was the point in this whole thing when I flipped. I thought to myself, this is all going to be okay, because when you really sort of stripped back what happened in 2013, it had nothing to do with running. It had everything to do with the forces of, I believe, and it's sort of, you strip it all away to its baseness, sort of good versus evil. And that simple email taught me, you know what, Joe, there are more good people in the world than there are evil people in the world, and things are simply going to be okay.
Have you told the story
I've
to your
told it. It's a
colleagues?
It's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
I've told it
And moving.
in a limited way, because in a very limited way, because there was so much going on in the aftermath of what happened in 2013 that I was limited in what really could take place. But I have told it now and then. So the Tommy Rocket Show is very lucky to hear this story, because I really haven't done it all that much.
It's hard not to get choked up.
Yes.
In the story. Yes.
Well, I hope you'll be in communication with that man someday.
Right.
You know,
right.
that would be it's awfully nice of him to reach out, especially when you needed it so much.
Yep. It really made me feel, I had been crying and upset in a way, and it really made me feel quite different. Mm-hmm. I thought to myself, no, this is, they're the minority. The majority is good. Is the guy on the London subway.
Yeah. And 10, 12 months forward, it proved to be prophetic. Everything went fine. It was a glorious day.
Correct.
And we have 1 minute left on the last segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. Peter, what will happen in the last minute of the Tommy Rocket Show?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't think we can top the London story. It's a beautiful story.
No, that's a beautiful story.
Because I do remember, I remember saying to myself, I wish they won't have it. It's going to be too much of I'm going to be too anxious.
Right.
And I think everyone was anxious.
No, but it was inspiring that they did do it.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. The final thing is that you never know what the marathon will hold in store. Just a final upbeat. This year, Des Linden was the first American woman to win the race since 1985, and it was wonderful to have an American woman win the race. Yeah. And that's what's so interesting about the marathon. It's been around for so long; it can serve up just about anything. Typically in the last few years, the marathon is all about speed. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you remember the weather in New England; it was simply horrific, and it was no longer a test of speed; it was a test of endurance. And it was so happy to see an American woman. Cross the finish line first.
And a Japanese school teacher.
And a Japanese school teacher. So it really became every man and every woman's race once again.
It was great, great.
Well, so much information, and I so appreciate you coming. Peter, this is your idea, this is your credit, and Joann, thank you so much. It was wonderful, and I hope my audience in Rhode Island has appreciated this show about the Boston Marathon. It's really inspiring to go out and run. And thank you for staying tuned to the Tommy Rocket Show. Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much.
So slip inside this funky house. Whoa, dishes in the sink, the TV's in repair.